let's get this show on the road. So this one here, it's one of the new panels I was working on, and it took me about 5 or 6 cons for it to start making sense. Because I've been interested in like gods, angry gods, positive gods, happy gods. I've been interested in folklore for a while. Some of you may have heard me talk about this 10 years ago when I started talking about what's the difference between a kami and a god. Some of you may have heard me talk at great length about why are we worried about Japanese monsters? Well, they're always trying to kill you. So why do we bow to them? So they don't kill you. And over time, I've just like more and more research keeps coming out that starts to break down the barriers between folklore traditions that for years I could talk about as conjecture, but now we're starting to see good research into it. And this particular panel, I like to talk about a very specific part of Japan that is a very, very strong meaning with me, and that's the Heian era. If you've ever talked to me for more than 10 minutes about Japanese history, you'll know I am obsessed with Heian Japan. It gets really interesting when you actually go to Japan. Because in Japan, every Japanese person I've ever met in my life has a favorite historical era and a favorite historical personage. Like, you will see beefs break out in the bar over Date Masamune versus Toyotomo Hideyoshi. And when you see 2 drunk salarymen screaming at each other about military achievements, you know that you've made it. But this leads to a moment where people come up to you as an American and they try to mess with you. First they ask you, do you have a favorite American historical personage? I don't. Not really. I used to just say Barack Obama, but that was too easy. I really don't, because while I'm in touch with my own history, I also don't care. So then they say, well, do you have a favorite Japanese personage? At which point I'm like, original Bishonen Minamoto no Yoshitsune. I want to dress like a girl, talk to a tengu, and then learn how to throw people over bridges. And that impresses people, because like, wait, you know the Heian era? I don't know the Heian era. Yeah, well, I don't know a lot about anything else. But Heian Japan is a major time period that I've always been obsessed with, because I like Game of Thrones.
Yes.
I do. I love House of the Dragon, but I like Game of Thrones, and that's what the Heian period is. It's multiple warrior families jockeying for power while the throne continues to lose influence. It is during this time period that you see a lot of changes to Japanese society that would impact the country for the next 1,000 years. This is when the emperor ceded all of his power because he had no money. So he ceded it to families who were bailing out the government. This is the time period where if you were a landowner with a large military, you could basically bully your way into court because no one could stop you. This was a time where ambition decreed how far you could go in society. And this is also a time where all the supernatural, religious, spiritual, sacred stuff started getting flipped entirely on its head.
So you're telling me this is the era of go big or go home?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
You think the Sengoku was go big or go home? The Sengoku was what, 90 years? This was 3 centuries.
So kind of like the first intermittent beard in Egypt.
I guess you could say that. I like to say it's the 3 kingdoms, but taken seriously.
For reference, for the literature fans, this is where the Tale of Genshi was written. The first novel that we can identify as a novel.
And the ways of talking about this particular period is, if you want to look at it from a spiritual, supernatural side, this was famous for 3 things. Well, 4 things. Poetry,
Yeah.
ghosts, booty calls, and poetry about ghosts giving booty calls.
Which are all in Tale of Genshi, by the way.
And it's during this time period that you start to see the cosmology of Japan start to change. This is a time when Buddhism started to take higher sway, where Shinto started to slowly decline to a point where by the end of it, it isn't much of a thing anymore. And this is a time when gods and demons ruled the world. Now, when I say gods and demons, it is very hard to say this in a way that does the concept justice. If I say the word God, you are immediately picturing something. Either you're picturing a bearded man in sandals going around saying, "Thou shalt not." Are you listening, you dumbass? Or you're picturing a guy in a toga possibly played by Russell Crowe hurling a lightning bolt at Chris Hemsworth. So when you're picturing a god, you're picturing something that we in the West would consider to be a god. Likewise, if I say demon, you are picturing potentially either someone in a red suit with a pitchfork, or you are picturing Crowley from Supernatural. But the thing is, when we're talking about demons and gods in Japan, the line is incredibly blurred because of transformation and perception. It is entirely possible for a god to also have a demonic side. Likewise, it is entirely possible for a demon to be entirely divine. The line between a god and a demon is literally how it is treating you. If it's being nice to you, it's a god. If it's being mean to you, it's a demon. If you're worshiping it because you want to, it's a god. If you're worshiping it because it says, do this or I burn your house down, it's a demon. The thing is, you're still doing the act, which leads to concepts like transformation and, of course, trolling. Demons aren't really interested in causing harm during this time period. They're more interested in screwing with us. They're very interested in crossing boundaries, messing with social mores, messing with you, and seeing how you respond to it. They witness human life, view human life to be basically pointless. The concept of, does an ant have a quarrel with a boot? They take that concept and just run with it. The demon can do whatever it wants. It knows it's going to get away with it. But what are you as a human going to do about it? Are you going to try to bribe the demon? Because they'll accept bribes. You can pay them in sake, rice, your firstborn, blood, or a booty call. Like I said, this is the hand here. They like their booty calls. It leads to the rise of the Janus-faced deity. The idea that they can be both good and evil at exactly the same time, and because they can do this, they love to just cross the boundaries and challenge all of it. It leads to a contextual understanding of what you're talking about. Some of the most powerful beings during this time period would drag you face first into hell for looking at them sideways, but also drag you face first into hell for insulting the Buddha. It literally comes down to how you see them. So a few things to remember. A lot of the time, these things are purveyors of boundaries. Heian Japan had a lot of boundaries putting up. There were boundaries between internal and external life. There were boundaries based on how pure you were, determined how close to the emperor, or in this case, the shogun, you were allowed to live. During this time period, boundaries made up the entire length and breadth of Japanese understanding. And if you were too impure, you would go beyond the final boundary and basically be turned into a monster yourself.
There's actually a really good book that was written as a companion piece to the Tale of Genji. It's The World of the Shining Prince. It was written in the 70s, the language is a bit dated, but it talks about, for example, the rank system. If you were not one out of 3 families, you could not go any higher than like 4th rank at all. So the idea of boundaries is really discussed in that book, and just how pervasive it was in various ways.
And this was the entire crux of Japanese administrative life. Where a demon comes in is the demon says, I don't care. And they try to subvert it or overwhelm it. The angry god's sole purpose is to find that boundary and to completely break it. And it doesn't matter who you are, they will try to find a way to break it. These are entities that overwhelm all of the aspects of daily life and find a way to break it down. The thing is, they're also necessary. They're such a key part of life at this point that entire festivals are designated solely to keeping them happy. Because sometimes it's better to have the evil being that sometimes likes you around versus what if it leaves and what replaces it is somehow worse. And don't create the politics, because if we're going to say what makes an angry god, this is all intrinsic to it. But really, what makes an angry god? Well, anger. That is universal. Every angry god is pissed off. What are they pissed off at? What have you got? And that is the whole concept behind these beings' power. But during the Heian period, almost every single divine entity in Japanese folklore was in some way angry. Kami, oh, they got in on the cursing game. If you forgot to clap and bow to them once, they would throw a pestilence at your house. Why? To remind you that they were there. Don't do it again. Don't screw up. Anger was such a... Got it? I was waiting for that to happen.
There we go.
Gotta love technology. Boom. Even the most benevolent beings that cared about your salvation at the same time had a mean streak in there. The kami of like perdition, the one that would make your life better, she would say all the sweet words and then say, what are you going to give me for it though? And this was a time period where anger was universal. Anger was in the people, anger was in the government, and anger was in the divinities. And every angry god was characterized, at least in part, by their anger. There was also a level of hubris. Arrogance and pride, I can get away with this because I'm more powerful than you. And whereas some beings would just do it to do it, the angry god would dangle it over your head and say, what are you going to do about it? I have all the power. How are you going to get around it? And that hubris gave the angry god its power, but also gave it its reason for being worshipped. You cannot talk about this without talking about politics. There is an entire class of angry god that simply exists because the government killed a bunch of humans. And those humans collectively decided, screw you, I'm going to burn this down because you killed me. There's an entire class that we'll get to in a minute about it. And finally, worship or else. Every angry god comes down to this as well. Because without that notion of worship me or suffer, you will not have the idea of the angry god. So the whole thing behind angry gods when you start looking at it is, these are both the good guys and the bad guys. These are actually Tibetan, but to be honest, Japan took one look at Tibetan Buddhism and said, allow me to copy that down. Oh, he only has 5 skulls? I'll give him 7 and a necklace of human teeth. Wait, that's skin? Ew, more skin. And the entire idea is, it's divine power, human-like ego. They will provide boons, but rather than giving them out of veneration, they give them out of fear. And the scarier and angrier and more violent the thing looked, the scarier and angrier and more violent the thing was. But at the same time, it was also the more righteous it was. This kind of duality between good and evil, righteous and irrighteous, it's all textbook. And then these games happen. Who here's played SNT5? Okay, so if you haven't played SNT5, I'm going to say a few things about Shin Megami Tensei 5. Number one, it is hands down the most user-friendly Shin Megami Tensei game I've ever played. If you've never really wanted to play a non-Persona SMT game because they're too complicated, play this one. I guarantee it is not. I guarantee you will get through this game with the minimum amount of pain. But what I love about SNT5 is it's the first time ever that I have played a Shin Megami Tensei game where they take this idea of God and demon and make it the central point of the game. I have always wondered why in SNT games they characterize Japanese gods, Buddhist entities, and other divine beings as demons. This is the game that explains why. Because basically, there's a god sitting on the throne of heaven, and if you are not him, you are a demon. He steals your knowledge, he gives it to his followers, and then he turns you into an enemy. That sounds familiar. Yes, this is also criticizing Christianity, like every single Shin Megami Tensei game does. It's just in this one, God is dead and you get to try to replace him.
The throne is empty is one of the taglines. If you find out that whoever's making the world sort of like work, that whoever has that position is gone. That being said, if you like your folklore, Shin Megami Tensei is a fun game franchise.
SMT5 is on sale right now because of early Black Friday deals.
I actually did check.
I highly...
Yeah.
No, I have a... Okay.
Like
This has been a thing between us for the last few months where kids see something that they want and they say, oh, I should get it. And my response is, oh, I already have it. Now for years, it was one of those, when we're together, I'll just give it to you. We got married, so we lived together. So why do we need 3 copies of the same video game?
We're better about that with books, though, admittedly. But also, when we talk about politics and the whole idea of like gods and demons, also keep in mind that We're speaking in English, and these terms are more fuzzy in Japanese. What gets called a kami, we'll get into. What gets called an oni depends on what direction you're looking at. Also, the whole idea of the fierce guardians of the Buddhas, like we were talking about.
Oh, let's just talk about the fierce guardians of the Buddhas. We'll just start right here with this.
Scary ones.
So, the idea of the holy adversary is something that I've gone into time and time and time again. You have your God, you have your Satan. You have your good guy standing at the top of the hill, like say your Zeus, and then you have your Cronus, your being trying to overtake and overthrow him. This is Mara, not the thing in the wheelchair that you find in Persona. That's disgusting for an 18+ panel, and I'm not putting it in there. But Mara is the anti-Buddha. And they're the anti-Buddha only insofar as if the Buddha represents the middle path, Mara represents excess. It is the polar opposite of the Buddha. It is a demon that challenges the Buddha because he doesn't think the Buddha is righteous enough. So what does he do? He goes to the Buddha, challenges him, at one point overthrows the Buddha, realizes the importance of the Buddha, takes the Buddha out of the ditch, puts the Buddha back on the road, and says, I will follow behind you. And if someone screws with you, I will tear their skin off, drink their blood, dance on their corpse, reanimate them, and then you can lecture at them as to why I just did that. Mara is so feared that according to official doctrine, when Amaterasu herself, the freaking sun, wanted to lay dominion to the islands of Japan, she walked up to Mara and said, can I rule over Japan, please? If you do this, I will make you a deity. And Mara says, I don't care, but you know what? You offered, sure. And he is venerated as a deity known as Kojin. Kojin is a deity of fire. He hangs out in your kitchen and cooks meat for you. But he also is a god of obstacles. Sometimes he doesn't cook the meat enough. And sometimes he burns your house down. Mara's position as the anti-Buddha and the big angry one is also the root for terms like Araburu Kami, which I'll get into later. These are the wild wandering gods, and you all have probably heard of one of them. He is also one of the sources for Aramitama, which Kit will get into, and is also the final source of a host of demonic entities that have actually been causing torment in Japan forever. So when this happens, Amaterasu, of course, says, why are you doing this? And Mara says, what, you didn't think I'd let you get away with this easy, did you? No, if you want to rule this island, fight my kids. Then we'll talk. By the way, thanks for making me a god. Peace. Now, this is just one of them. Another one that pops up, some of you may recognize this one from Shin Megami Tensei. Hariti started life, okay, let me put this here. Who here has ever heard of Lilith?
Okay.
So, y'all know who Lilith is. So, we have this idea of, at one point, it's a being that consumes children, later becomes a deity of childbirth, but is still reviled. That's Hariti. Hariti started as an evil mother that liked to torment children. She would cause miscarriages, she would drink the blood of infants, and she was the scariest thing you would ever see. Well, one day, she's walking along the road, and what happens? She meets the Buddha. And the Buddha says, have you thought about not eating children? And Hariti says, why do you care? You can't have kids. Out of my way. Buddha sidesteps. She starts walking forward. And she bumps into Mara. And Mara says, have you considered listening to the Buddha? Mr. Buddha, what do you have to say for yourself? And the Buddha actually converts her. He explains that there's more to be found by being a guardian of children. Now, if she wants to just be a raging B-word to anyone else, by all means, for that is your nature. I am not telling you to betray your nature. I am simply saying, maybe don't kill children. And Hariti thinks to herself, I can get behind this. Sure. After that, she gets converted into a symbol of divine motherhood. Now, while her name is derived from the term to steal, so you can see where this is going, now her sole job is to protect children. And if you try to threaten them, she will go medieval on you. This level of reformation is found all over the place when you look at old Japanese and old Buddhist folklore.
Yeah, as an aside here, so because the way that Buddhism and Shinto traditions and other traditions work in Japan, kami becoming Buddhist is a thing. They were worshipped together often, and often kami and other spirits were considered, spirits can still be enlightened because the Dharma, the Buddhist Dharma was basically seen as sort of like gravity of it affected everyone, including spirits in the unseen world. So that's just an important aside to know as we go through this.
It is actually very commonplace for beings that wanted to destroy the world suddenly becoming Buddhist, and now they don't want to destroy the world anymore, so they turn their rage on you. I'll get to this in a minute. Some of you may have heard of the Gozei Shiteno before. This is the original Elite Four. Whenever you see an Elite Four in anything, they're referring to these four fellows. These are the Japanese devas: Tamonten, Jikokuten, Kumokuten, and Zojoten. The guardians of the four cardinal directions. They came over from China. They have their roots in Taoism and also in Buddhism. And their sole job is to stand and protect. These are the ones that actually created the lines of demarcation. So when I say that you can be banished beyond a cardinal point, removed from society, if you try to come back in, you deal with one of these. And these four beings are the angriest of angry gods, but they never became demonic. Rather, when they would encounter demonic threats, they would beat them into the ground and then tell those demonic threats, what have you learned? That we shouldn't fight you. And that we should fight for you. And praise be the Buddha. Okay, get up. But when you go to temples, you'll often see them at the four cardinal positions defending a temple. You'll find them in cities, defending the borders of cities. These were the original angry deva, whose sole purpose is to keep the bad things out. And I just wanted to bring up this guy for one specific reason. This is Bishamonten, otherwise known as Tamonten, otherwise known as the King in the North. And while that meme is 11 years old, it's important to be reminded that for the entirety of Japanese history, when the Yamatos swept across the country, they went from west to east, and they stopped as they started to go north, because there were people in the north that fought against them. The ancestors of the Ainu, those that remained from the Amishi, those that remained on the island fighting against these foreign invaders, eventually themselves were made demons. Why? Because they stood against imperial order. When you were exiled from Japan and told you are not allowed to be here anymore, they would send you north of the wall. And the moment you went north, you were no longer seen as human. At that point, you were the monster they were fighting. And every time an army started to push further and further north, they would push those people further and further and further into the mountains, eventually to the end of the island, eventually north into Hokkaido. And they kept them out of the country. The king in the north was the most powerful of them because he was always the one on the front lines. He was the one who protected the Minamoto clan, who were the kings in the north for a long time, but he also would come back later as one of the forms of Uesugi Kenshin, the warlord, who fought with the ferocity of Tamonten when he took to the battlefield. Fun fact, he was from the north. Now, this is Ashra. Ashra is the god of wrath, likely a conflation or an exaggeration, but this is the kind of being that thrives on beating the hell out of you for no reason other than that's what he does. And the fun thing about Ashra is, it's construed with demons, demigods, and anti-gods, but ultimately, he is pleasure. Pleasure by any means. Now, maybe you've heard me say before that Shinto and some forms of Buddhism, and we talked about this with Shugendo yesterday, are experiential. When you feel something, that's when you know you're still alive, and because of that sensation, any kind of sensation is considered pleasurable. This is the kind of guy that says, okay, let's turn this into a Hellraiser movie.
I was actually going to say, thinking of Ashra as a Cenobite makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, all the things he wishes to show you as he drives pins into your head.
Yeah.
But he's also one of the good guys. His realm is eternal fighting. His realm is pretty much Valhalla, but with more fighting and less boobs.
To the point that Ashra is used in sayings to mean destruction, and it's not so much the act of fighting, it's taking pleasure in being bloodthirsty.
Yes.
That's the difference here.
In the Essentials of Rebirth, that book that talks about Japanese hells, one of the places that you can be sent is to the realm of the Ashra, where all you do is fight for all eternity. Want it?